there appears to be at least some degree of consideration in Ankara that some sort of military confrontation is not only possible, but possibly preferable, right? Or it could be a kind of, would serve as some sort of lasting solution to this, these series of problems that beset the Turkish-Greek relationship.
Greece. Look at history. Go back in time. If you go too far, the price will be heavy. We only have one sentence for Greece. Do not forget Izmir. After months of hostile aerial and naval encounters between Greek and Turkish armed forces, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan gave this remarkable speech in September. By referring to the 1922 burning of the Greek Anatolian city of Izmir by the Turkish army, Erdogan's threat to Greece was crystal clear. It's a snapshot of a foreign policy that has been decried as revanchist by some of its critics, but is logically assertive by its supporters. From the outside, it can be hard to understand. How can it be that this NATO member is at loggerheads with its Greek neighbour, trade diplomatic blows with European capitals while still technically applying for the EU membership, and participate in NATO peacekeeping missions? To understand, we invited Ryan Gingeras, an expert of Turkish foreign policy, to take stock of the country's foreign policy. Is there such a thing as an Erdogan doctrine? Ryan Gingeras is a professor in the Department of National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School. He's an expert on Turkish, Balkan, and Middle East history, and the author of 6 books, including the forthcoming The Last Days of the Ottoman Empire, which will be released later this month. The views he expresses here are not those of the Naval Postgraduate School, the United States Navy, the Department of Defense, or any part of the United States government. He appeared on this show in a personal capacity, and the opinions he gives are his own. As always, please rate and review Uncommon Decency on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts, and send us your comments or questions either on Twitter at undecencypod, or by email at undecencypod@gmail.com. But please consider supporting the show through our Patreon, where you'll get access to extended content and early episodes. We hope you enjoy this episode.
So, I think to begin, if we had to give kind of a broad understanding of Turkish foreign policy, there's always an attempt to draw up a kind of single doctrine, a Truman doctrine, a Reagan doctrine. Is there a Erdogan doctrine? And usually when we talk about, Erdogan and Turkish foreign policy,
how do I make sense of Turkish foreign policy? Week to week would be my response. I think, frankly, it's tempting to try to distill Turkish foreign policy into some kind of brief, all-encapsulating phrase. Neo-Ottomanism is one. One of Erdogan's advisors, Ibrahim Cullen, recently used the phrase "precious loneliness." There is, a lot of, I think a lot of incentives to try to distill it, because the polarity of Turkish foreign policy appears to shift. It appears at times both accommodating and confrontational. I think in some ways, the only way that you can perhaps center it on something is on Erdogan's immediate needs, as well as his various, I guess, sort of impulses and motivations. I don't know if there's necessarily a doctrine that can neatly encapsulate those kinds of trends or those kinds of impulses that you see within Turkish foreign policy. In large measure because, his interests Erdogan's interests derive not simply from, his aspirations on the world stage. It also very much reflects his, domestic priorities or his domestic insecurity at times. And so, you could say that certainly he has a certain romantic affection for Ottoman history, at the very least, because I think it symbolizes the kinds of things that he would like his rule to be associated with, which is grandeur, power, global influence, this kind of general largesse of being the leader of a prominent state. He's quite willing to pursue these goals while maintaining a veneer of being a partner and ally within NATO, while being an interlocutor with Russia, casting off both at the same time, again depending on the issues. I would say that if we're to assume that he is to remain in power over the next year, his impulses may again change, again depending on where Turkey finds itself economically, how conditions may change regionally. It's really, really hard to say. So I wish I could give a more satisfying answer than that, but I'm really afraid I can't.
But let's zoom in specifically on the kind of neo-Ottoman argument. The idea that, the case is quite compelling. We are in an era of returns, the return of the empire. The empires strike back. And obviously the Turkish Empire is the Ottoman Empire. And in many ways, we're seeing a much more assertive Turkey on the international stage than maybe 20 or 30 years ago, in the Mediterranean, in Syria. So what do you make of this, of this case of, and he had a foreign affairs minister not so long ago who was quite clearly a proponent of this kind of neo-Ottoman policy. What is neo-Ottomanism, and how much do you think it kind of is useful to kind of make sense of what is going on with Turkey?
I suppose it's useful only as so far as you maybe don't take it so literally. I think that the phrase neo-Ottoman is again, it's a tempting way of characterizing Turkish foreign policy, because there is so much active allusion made toward the empire, not simply by Erdogan, not simply by other figures within Ankara, but generally within Turkish society today. It's quite clear that it's a source of inspiration, as well as a source of pride. I think that when you look back 10, 15, 20 years, it's certainly the case that the emergence of Turkey as a more proactive force in international politics is rooted in the work of Ahmet Davutoglu, who was, as you referenced, he was Erdogan's foreign minister for a time. He was prime minister for a time. And he wrote an influential work in which he essentially roots a vision of Turkey's foreign policy against the backdrop of its broader history. In other words, for Davutoglu, he asserted that Turkey had a legitimate claim to having an active foreign policy because Turkey's lineage is rooted in the Ottoman experience, the Ottoman Empire being a state having an influence, having played a role in the development of regional politics in the Middle East, in Southeastern Europe, in the Black Sea, even further away in Africa and the Indian Ocean, and blah blah blah. Those historical connections in Davutoglu's mind is the foundation for Turkey having an active foreign policy. It's not necessarily seen from the outset as the foundation for rebuilding the Ottoman Empire, and I think that's where it gets a little bit more unhelpful. That I'm not necessarily sure Erdogan or anybody else in Ankara is after is actively seeking to rebuild territorially the Ottoman Empire, or even structurally the Ottoman Empire. I think that more than anything, it serves as a historical point of reference, or a series of points of reference, in thinking about Turkey's relationship to various places in the world, and providing a reason for Turkey to play a more active role in those places. And so, for example, when you talk about, let's say, Turkey's relationship with Greece, it's hard for Erdogan or anybody else in Turkey to not reference the past in talking about what many people believe are Turkey's natural rights or natural interests. So I think in that respect, neo-Ottomanism can be helpful. Doesn't necessarily fully articulate what is, kind of the compass that, is helping to steer Ankara, towards foreign policy or anything else.
Something else, Ryan, I think could be interesting to bring up here is perhaps a kind of neo-Ottoman label also misses something which is, I think, quite new in Turkey's positioning the past few years at least, is the kind of desire for Erdogan to take the mantle of, kind of Islamic nations worldwide. It was quite obvious after he got in a pretty open spar with Macron, when Macron made a speech against the rise of Islamism. You had Erdogan coming out saying Macron is being Islamophobic, and there was all those tensions. There was those boycotts of French products going internationally. There's also always been these tensions with Germany when Erdogan in 2020, I believe, he was speaking out against German authorities when they raided a mosque in Berlin. So there's been this kind of desire in Turkey, apparently, to get to become maybe not a kind of an Islamist foreign policy, but at least to be able to kind of be a leader in the Muslim world in a way that is kind of much more pronounced than just simply kind of neo-Ottomanism.
When you look at this, this trend in his behavior, more specifically perhaps in Erdogan's rhetoric, again, there is this temptation to see this as an outgrowth of a kind of revanchism centered on, reconstructing in some way the Ottoman Empire. If you step back from it, there's a couple of ways that you can, maybe recenter the ways in which you think about Erdogan in a way that I think is a little bit more nuanced and I think is sort of a little bit more accurate. I think first and foremost, there has been a tendency in Turkish foreign policy, not especially pronounced, it's not as well known, but there has long been a tendency in Turkish foreign policy to set Turkey up or to present Turkey as a leader of a certain type of state, right? Specifically, states that are predominantly Muslim and or states that are predominantly secular within the wider world, right? There are cases going back to virtually the founding of the Turkish Republic in 1923, where Turkey set itself up as a kind of role model state. Okay, and I think that that in part is weaves itself into this presumption that Turkey can and should play a leadership kind of role. Now, specifically when it comes to Erdogan's rhetoric around Muslim solidarity or Muslim grievance, in part this too most certainly reflects a global ambition, and a global ambition that is in part rooted in the ways in which he sees the Ottoman Empire as perhaps, at the very least, a source of inspiration or even perhaps a model. But on the other hand, it is a reflection of the ways in which he thinks of Turkish nationalism and the ways in which, he embodies this turn within Turkish nationalist ideology towards a kind of Muslim nationalism, right? Which I should say is, has become, somewhat commonplace in various parts of the world when we look comparatively at the evolution of nationalism in now the 21st century. There is greater emphasis placed upon Muslim identity within Turkey and in various places around the world, as well as this willfulness to draw connections between the plight of Muslims in one part of the world versus another, right? And so when he talks about Islamophobia in Europe, or let's say, he harangues the world at their willful, ignorance or their lack of interest in, let's say, the Rohingya in Southeast Asia, or other issues that pertain to Muslims. Yes, there's a foreign policy aspect to this But there's also very much a domestic aspect to this. And it's very much rooted in this desire by him, by his party, by those who are around him to change fundamentally the fabric of Turkish nationalism. And it just so happens there is this foreign policy component.
We're going to pivot a little bit towards talking about Turkey's relationship with the EU, and we will talk about the accession process and how that's stalled over the years. But I just wanted to start by sort of setting the picture for what Turkey is doing in Europe's periphery and in some cases its neighborhood. So it launched military interventions in Libya, which is what had been a key oil hub for Europe. It's the principal strategic partner for Azerbaijan, who's also a key gas supplier. Its TB2 drone played a key role in that war in Nagorno-Karabakh in 2020. It also assists in peacekeeping efforts in Serbia and in oversight of the Dayton Agreement in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is also looking like a potential hotspot in Europe's neighborhood. And it's becoming increasingly assertive in the Eastern Mediterranean as it relates to gas supply. So from a strategic perspective, Turkey is involved in a lot of areas where Europe has key interests. And my question to you is, should the EU see these as challenges to its authority in these areas, or as an opportunity perhaps for cooperation and deepening collaboration with Turkey?
I would say at the very least, Erdogan would like these various issues to be the basis upon which the EU would engage Turkey. I think that's the most accurate and conservative thing you can say, at least from Turkey's standpoint. I'm not sure necessarily how the EU is supposed to engage directly with Turkey on matters of energy, because I'm not necessarily sure what other alternatives the EU has. I can't, I don't necessarily possess a very strong background in energy politics when it comes to the EU. What I would say is that it seems to me that Brussels balances these issues of energy alongside a host of other issues when it comes to Turkey that cuts in different ways. I think from my standpoint, Brussels' approach towards Turkey, it's a little bit more complex than the United States, but I think they share a certain attribute, which is there are lots of people in Brussels who would like to make the Turkey relationship work in and beyond certain advantages Turkey may offer with respect to, say, energy or trade. They want the relationship to work because if it doesn't work, there are really grave implications. At least that's what people believe. And I think that this is what makes the relationship somewhat chaotic and fraught.
And to go specifically on Turkey and Greece, there's been a very visible and tense flare-up between both countries on the issues of the islands in the Aegean. You wrote an article which is quite remarkable on this issue on the 5th of October for War on the Rocks, which is titled, let me just have it here, Why Erdogan Might Choose a War with Greece, and is a little jarring actually to read. Is there really a chance that Turkey can actually find itself at war with Greece? And both countries, of course, are NATO members.
So I wrote this article largely because I think that there is a received wisdom in among people who follow Turkey or just sort of generally follow European politics or geopolitics as a whole, that stipulates that Greece and Turkey have been at odds with one another for a very long time, have come close to all-out war on more than one occasion, most recently in the 1990s, although there was a very brief and somewhat uncertain moment about 2 years ago when things got a bit hot off Turkey's coast. But, be that as it may, there is this received wisdom that Turkey and Greece are at times, close to conflict, maybe close to conflict, but saner heads prevail, right? And the reason why is that the consequences of such a conflict are so grave neither party really would be able to stomach an actual shooting war. And this is an issue that I've followed pretty closely over the last couple of years. And one thing that struck me is the degree to which the ways in which people in Turkey specifically see this issue bears some resemblance, not total resemblance, but some resemblance to the ways in which Americans saw Iraq in the late 1990s, early 2000s, in which the issue of Greece, or put more of a finer point on it, the very specific issue of the Aegean Islands, and I could go into sort of what those issues are if you'd like, but suffice to say in the moment that from Ankara's perspective, from the broader perspective of the Turkish population, these are issues that are of long standing. They have lingered, interminably in a way that's exasperating. Okay. There's a full consensus across the Turkish political spectrum that Turkey is in its right to raise grievances with Greece, but for reasons, some of which are beyond Turkey's control, Greece still holds this upper hand. Now, there is an equally strong consensus, I would argue, that there is a strong belief that if there was a conflict, it would be over quickly, it would be decisive, and that Turkey would come out on top. And this is based on Turkey's recent performance in various, military campaigns, be it in Syria or be it in Azerbaijan or in Libya, and that Greece is fundamentally weak. Greece is fundamentally risk averse. And that it all is, sort of needed. In reality, it's just a bit more muscle, a little bit more of a push, right? Now, to kind of bring it down to brass tacks, I think that a conflict may not be overwhelmingly likely, but I think that rhetorically, there appears to be at least some degree of consideration in Ankara that some sort of military confrontation is not only possible, but possibly preferable, right? Or it could be a kind of, would serve as some sort of lasting solution to this, these series of problems that beset the Turkish-Greek relationship. And this is sort of what I try to outline in the article. And the last thing I'd say about it is that there's a lot of analysis now, and most recently you saw it in a New York Times article over the weekend, that this is an issue that has emerged exclusively because of the election that is looming in Turkey in the summer of 2023, and that this would serve, some sort of, crisis with Greece would serve as a kind of wag the dog scenario in which Turkey would drum up support, Erdogan would drum up support, specifically among nationalists, and that this, any kind of confrontation would be in the service of his re-election campaign. I don't necessarily see it that way. I think that this there's been a fair amount of continuity in Turkey's approach towards Greece. The rhetoric, has there's a fair amount of consistency in terms of rhetoric. And more importantly, it is something that's conceived of as not simply as an electoral issue, but a matter of geopolitical necessity. It's a matter of existential necessity in terms of the desire to have it solved and solved soon within Turkish foreign policy circles. So I think it's something that people should take seriously, not necessarily that it's bound to happen or destined to happen, but I think it's something people definitely should take seriously.
And I think what's quite interesting is those kind of conflicts sometimes can happen over kind of miscalculations and the whole sleepwalking process described by Christopher Clark doing 1-1. And you're talking about the Turkish election, but there's also a Greek election happening a month later in July, actually. So you could be in a kind of very interesting situation where both sides kind of end up being backed in a corner, and especially given the kind of political environment you're describing in Turkey, it looks like it'd be very difficult for Erdogan to kind of back back out of such a situation. But one thing actually I want to talk a little bit about is, I think in 2020, Macron famously told to Sophie Pédère of The Economist that NATO was brain dead. Now, obviously, since the invasion of Ukraine, it seems like NATO had a bit of a brain surgery, and its purpose is now very clear to a lot of people. But what's interesting, and I think what a lot of people seem to forget, is he's actually referring to Turkey when he's making those brain dead comments. He's saying that it doesn't make any sense that it's roughly the moment where you have this huge escalation between Greece and Turkey going on, and he's saying it doesn't make any sense that two allies within NATO are at this level of kind of tensions. How does Turkey approach NATO at this point? How do they approach, and also obviously behind NATO, the United States, because there seems to be increasing tensions with America, but at the same time they're still very much part of NATO. How does the kind of political climate on NATO and the United States look like in Turkey, and how does kind of Erdogan navigate this kind of tight balancing act?
A few years ago, I think it was in 2016, there was a book that was published called Inside the Black Box, and it was published by a former Turkish army officer who conducted a series of surveys of officers essentially across all services and across all ranks. And he polled them on a series of different issues. And one of the most interesting findings that you see in this study is that officers across the various services in Turkey genuinely find membership in NATO to be of significant value in terms of things like readiness, significant value in terms of training and operational compatibility, not simply within NATO, but in sort of within the combined forces themselves. And so, in short, that in military terms, it's something of real value. What his studies also seem to suggest is that the officer corps specifically wasn't necessarily wedded exclusively to NATO's view of collective security. In fact, an overwhelming majority of officers, now this was a while back, this was in 2016, I would say, saw it of value. I forget what the percentage was. It was like 86%, but a significant number saw it of value for Turkey to explore other collective security agreements, for example, with the Shanghai group. And I think what that tells us is that, within the military, but, perhaps I would say, and I think we can be even a little bit confident about this, even without a poll, within civilian circles, people understand that NATO gives Turkey advantages. It's also very clear that that the Turkish security establishment does not necessarily see that commitment or that relationship as one that completely defines the ways in which they think about security, or they think about the relationship on a bilateral level with different member states, or with the general collective of NATO nations. So, in short, I think what we see now is a Turkey that very much has its cake whenever it wants and eats it too. And I think that's not going to change, because in essence, there isn't any other way to force Turkey to redefine its relationship. There is no mechanism to kick Turkey out of NATO. Any effort to hold, let's say, Turkey accountable, whether it's rhetorically or through some other device, actually, at least in terms of the ways in which I think it's generally conceived in NATO, actually hurts NATO more than it hurts Turkey. And I think that, especially now in 2022, with NATO so heavily committed in Ukraine, there is a real... aversion to try to cause too much of of a disturbance within the general NATO-Turkey relationship, and that may also go for the relationship bilaterally. That there are limits to which one can express their discontent. So, Macron's statement in 2020, I mean, you're right in pointing it out. It came at a time in which the stakes were considerably lower than they are now. But I think going forward, I think that what will be interesting to watch is ways in which states may be able to try to circumvent Turkey and its role. And you could see it in terms of things. For example, you're mentioning France, France's security guarantees that it has made with Greece. Okay, which is outside the framework of NATO, but very much kind of formed within the general universe of kind of collective security politics within Europe. So, I mean, those are things that one may see in the future, and I'm not necessarily sure Turkey has an answer for that kind of arrangement or those sorts of prospects for the future.
So, Ryan is out, and there's a lot to break down here. But what's your biggest take so far on this kind of very long and fascinating conversation on the state of Turkey's foreign policy, and maybe some things that kind of really stood out to you?
I think the comment that stood out to most was in his discussion of the prospects of war with Greece in the Aegean, is highlighting the fact that that is not just a domestic posturing issue for Erdogan, but the fact that this is really an existential issue for Turkish politicians and nationalist figures within Turkey. In the article that we referenced in War on the Rocks, which I truly encourage everyone to go and read, he quotes a member of the opposition saying that Erdogan has actually not been tough on this issue at all, because a real leader would just go in and seize the island, as Turkey did for North Cyprus. And I think that element of Turkish policy, when you see the coverage of Turkish foreign policy, it's so much about Erdogan, and it's not enough about the domestic forces that might be shaping Turkish foreign policy. And I think it rings most true for me, at least, in that standoff with Greece.
Something which we talked about a bit later on in the Patreon conversation, which I thought was quite interesting, is the kind of those tensions with Greece are happening amidst a kind of rise in tensions in Turkey with America specifically, but also kind of NATO more generally. There's been a distinctive attempt at having a cakeist foreign policy, having your NATO cake and eating your outside of NATO cake at the same time, which has been in full display, as Ryan said, during the past few months of the war in Ukraine, with Turkey seemingly playing all sides at the same time. But I think it kind of reaches to kind of a different conversation, which is, I'm not so sure there's so much of a breakdown of alliances, and we're seeing the importance of NATO, its relevance at least, during this conflict in Ukraine, but maybe a breakdown in the scope and scale of these alliances, where you're kind of being reduced to a kind of much more limited, how could I say this, nuclear center, so to speak. And maybe we could call this minilateralism. But I thought the alliance that France made with Turkey, well, not explicitly enlightened. It's at first a defense procurement deal, which was kind of enhanced into a strategic defense partnership. We could be seeing things like that happening increasingly within NATO, but also within kind of larger alliances, where you feel there's a need for kind of a distinct partnership to respond to a precise threat or a precise challenge. And I just find it very interesting. I think that Turkey knows right now it's having the best of both worlds. But the question is, if by pushing it too much, it could actually, could we essentially have kind of a shadow NATO within NATO, where you have essentially Turkey being excluded of all the important conversations, and it's normally part of NATO, but it's lacking on many of the important intelligence sharing, or no longer invited to some exercises, or has limited positions in kind of NATO headquarters. That could be a possibility, maybe.
It's similar to some of the discussions we've had about the European Union. George Osborne liked to float this in the build-up to the referendum, the idea of or during the negotiation with the European Union prior to the referendum, of a two-tier Europe, where there's the core states that integrate fully, and then there's the peripheral states who are members of the trading bloc, show up to the meetings but don't integrate fully. And we sort of have two tracks for what you want for Europe. And for NATO, that could be a similar path, in part because NATO has redefined itself really since the collapse of the Soviet Union as a defensive umbrella for nascent democracies and for protection of democratic values in various conflict zones around the world. Turkey and indeed some other members of NATO don't necessarily agree with that mission for the organization, but Turkey is strategically vital for NATO. It's the second largest military within NATO by numbers of armed forces, and it's engaged in many peacekeeping missions and indeed offensive conflicts around, well, I won't say around the world because it's mostly in the Mediterranean basin, but it's engaged in a lot of activities. So it is still an important partner for NATO as an organization. But if you start to see NATO transitioning into a democracy promotion security alliance, then Turkey, whose foreign policy isn't really geared towards that, might not want to align itself too closely with NATO, and maybe you'll start to see that two-track system that some people have broached for Europe becoming a thing for NATO. And then the last thing I'll say on this, though, is that Turkey's unique geopolitical position, both in terms of its geography, its history, and its culture, means that NATO's always had that grounding in the Euro-Atlantic, and Turkey is it's a Mediterranean country, it's an Asiatic country. Some people would argue there's strands of European elements to it, but it doesn't really fit in that Euro-Atlantic mold.
Yeah.
And some of those conversations, and Ryan mentioned this when talking about, say, the difference between Poland and Hungary being in the EU versus Turkey being in the EU, is that it doesn't have that grounding in Euro-Atlanticism, and that can be a cause for divergence.
Yeah. On the EU, I think that's kind of a really interesting conversation. Obviously, Ryan is not an expert on EU politics; he's more focused on the Turkish side. But it's actually quite staggering to see how much the conversation has just simply collapsed in a matter of a decade. Because there wasn't much progress 10 years ago, but at least the conversation was still going. There's still goodwill. At this point, I remember actually when I was working with Ben Haddad at the Hudson Institute in DC, I remember working on an article he got published in Foreign Policy, I believe, where he was calling for the EU to break off with Turkey on the accession, saying it was kind of a complete hypocrisy. Everyone knew it wasn't going to happen. It was just creating unnecessary frustration. And I mean, I still stand by a lot of things that were written back then. It's going nowhere. It's creating frustration. It's creating also kind of fantasies. We all remembered the last weeks of Brexit, how the potential accession of Turkey to the EU was a big decider as well. It just feels like it's completely unnecessary. And also, on top of that, undeniably, Turkey has taken a turn for the worse in its foreign policy of the past decade. I talked about it a little bit, but Erdogan's pressure on European democracy over issues like secularism, or using its diaspora to as kind of an electoral weapon, is simply unacceptable. And on top of that, there's been kind of an attempt to harness some kind of Muslim nationalism on the international stage, which has been hugely confrontational with Europe, and specifically with France and Germany. At this point, it feels like we are just adding tension to tension, and we should really be considering being a little stiffer with Turkey, and making sure they understand where our limits are.
I'm not sure I can fully accept that the foreign policy has gone for the worse. I think Turkey, in many ways, is doing things that other countries do, but they're getting criticized for it because Erdogan himself has a negative image in many Western capitals and in the Western press because of his domestic politics and his domestic political rhetoric. But in terms of the way Turkey has been more of an activist in certain parts of the globe, Turkey is the one that has stepped in to try and provide stability in Libya when Britain, France, and the United States essentially washed their hands of the situation after removing Gaddafi. Turkey is the one that stepped in to provide military support to the UN-backed government in Tripoli. And so I think Turkey is doing a lot of activist and interventionist things overseas and rediscovering that voice that it had enjoyed for the better part of 500 years, on and off, granted. But it's doing it in a way that is making the more traditional powers uncomfortable because of the brashness with which Erdogan has been doing it, which has been central to his appeal at a domestic level. So I'm not sure I can fully accept that it's gotten worse. I think it's gotten more assertive, and I think it's for the benefit of Turkey's image globally and for its influence globally. You see the number of alliances that Erdogan has been able to make, and sort of one unheralded thing, although it probably won't go anywhere, has been an attempt by Erdogan to actually reach out and normalize relations with Armenia. And we don't need to sort of, everyone is aware of the history between those two countries and the genocide, obviously, that took place. But that's a sort of unheralded thing that Turkey's regional role has enabled it to do when other powers wouldn't necessarily be able to do that because they hadn't earned that reputation of being assertive, of being involved, of being engaged in various hotspots around the world.
Well, I wasn't thinking about what was going on in Libya. I was rather thinking about kind of very direct confrontations that's been going on. I mean, Turkey was one of the loudest voices on the boycott of French products 2 years ago, which just kind of a very tense moment in Franco-Turkish diplomatic relations, at least probably the most tense moment in a long while. But it's an interesting conversation. I think we probably will do another episode on maybe more specifically Erdogan and more of a national angle, because it's actually quite remarkable to see how much this country has transformed itself in 20 years. I know my girlfriend used to live in Turkey with a family 15 years ago. And I mean, it's a country that's been changing very quickly. And it's definitely worth a conversation on kind of Erdogan and national politics angle, given the election coming this summer, which should be quite important. But anyways, thanks a lot to Ryan for coming on the show. Thanks a lot, Julian, for being here as well. Although you are kind of contractually obliged to be here, but thank you so much. And a special thank you for all of our wonderful patrons. I really think, once again, the patron conversation we just had with Ryan was incredibly insightful and really adds a lot of nuance and background to the conversation we had. And so thank you for our patrons, Guy, Paloma, Henry, Carol, Martina, Raphael, and David, for sponsoring the show and really allowing us to have bigger dreams and keep returning to the show every week. Thanks a lot, Julian.
Thank you. And yes, I encourage everyone to check out Ryan's work. He's got a couple of books on Kemal Ataturk. Yeah. For those of you interested in that transition between the Ottomans and the modern Turkish state. And as we mentioned in the show, he has a book coming up soon on the Decline and Fall of the Empire. The Last Days of the Ottoman Empire. I have to get the title right. Every time there's a book about the last days of an empire, I always go Decline and Fall. Thank you, Edward Gibbon.
Yeah.
But yes, I encourage everyone to check it out.
Absolutely. So to all of you, I say see you next week.